Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Lauren Oakes. Lauren is an ecologist and writer who writes on forest, climate, and the complex relationship humans have with nature. She has her Ph.D. from the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program for Environment and Resources at Stanford University. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Scientific America, Emergence Magazine, and many other media outlets. She's the author of her first book, In Search of the Canary Tree, which has won numerous awards. And she is the author of the most recent book, Treekeepers, The Race for a Forested Future. And that's the book we talk about in the conversation. We talk about many aspects of forest and trees. We talk about the more recent study that came out in 2019 on global tree restoration, talking about planting 1 trillion trees. We talk about the impact of forests on the planet and how we obtain data on forests. We talk about what is a forest, how we define that, define some other terms that sort of get confused, such as reforestation, afforestation. We talk about forest transition. We talk about the Carboniferous period. We also discuss the land gap report, carbon accounting, offsets, incentive structures, ecosystem services, urban forests, and many other topics. I really enjoyed this conversation. Lauren is quite wonderful on the topic. She's a fantastic writer, such a joy to be in conversation with, and about a topic that's really important. Obviously, the planet's important, our homes are important, where we live, the environment, and it's all really good on the data side, and it's really good, engaging writing that she has. So it was a lot of fun to have this conversation. You can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over there, like, subscribe, share with your friends, and now I bring you Lauren Oakes. I am here with Lauren Oakes. Lauren, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, pleasure to join you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You've written a really gem of a book. I really enjoyed reading this. It's called Treekeepers, The Race for a Forested Future. This is out through the lovely Basic Books. I think it's just out, right? I think this is back in November. This is when this came out. So it's still new.
Yeah, November 12th, and then December 12th is coming out in the UK.
Nice. Okay, so great. That's great timing on everything.
So it's stage 2 coming up.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's very new, and so we're going to talk all about it, which I'm excited to do. But before we do, just tell listeners just a snapshot of who you are, professionally, and what you usually spend your time doing.
Yeah, great to be here. I'm an ecologist, environmental scientist by training. So I went to Stanford and I trained in an interdisciplinary program. But my expertise really has been in how forests and people adapt to climate change. And I've done a lot of field-based research, but what I love is the storytelling and writing. So I wrote a first book called In Search of the Canary Tree, which came out of my research while I was at Stanford. It's about a tree species in Alaska that's dying because of climate change, and it's a story really of hope, of looking towards the communities and the ecosystems that are adapting in light of so many dramatic changes. I've kind of always gone between storytelling and science, and I guess I love the mix of the two. And so right now I'm pretty much a full-time writer. Feels a little, whoa, okay. But I've been a teacher, an educator, and I have also worked for a couple NGOs. I worked for the Wildlife Conservation Society for a number of years after my PhD. But now I love the storytelling, and I had been working at the Wildlife Conservation Society at the time, and I was working on their forest and climate change team, so helping communities in various places around the world implement, forest management plans and ecosystem management plans. And this book was kind of just like floating around in the background. When In Search of the Canary Tree came out in 2018, I started looking towards countries out of curiosity that were experiencing like an increase in forest cover. So while there's been a lot of media on and a lot of news and a lot of important studies on what's happening in some of the tropical areas in the Amazon, in the Congo, Indonesia, and deforestation, there are countries that have been experiencing an increase in forest cover. And I was kind of captivated by that as like, well, what's happening in those countries? Around that time, so 2019, there was a study that came out and it was published in Science and it got a ton of media hits right away. The study was looking at basically how many trees uh, the world could support in the absence of people. And the
This was
researchers,
the
one of the
this sorry, this is the global tree restoration potential that was
that's
published in
right, yeah.
2019. It was 1 trillion trees to save the planet and all this stuff.
That's right. They were looking at, basically in the absence of people, where could trees grow back? And the senior author, Tom Crowther, who's a ecologist and a researcher at ETH Zurich, had also done a study a few years prior that had said, the world used to support 6 trillion trees. Now we're down to about 3 trillion since the dawn of human civilization. And so in some ways, this was like a striking follow-up some years later to then say, well, wow, we could probably grow another trillion. Um, and that article, and the media that followed, and some of the promotion they did, just blew up. And all of a sudden, there were a lot of governments and there were a lot of governments and companies saying, we should plant trees. And you had people across the full political spectrum, and oil executives standing up in support of planting trees. And it looked like this was some, silver bullet, silver bullet solution to climate. So those things combined, I felt like planting a tree, in recent years has become this catch-all way to do something good for the planet. How many of us have like bought a T-shirt or a holiday card or something, and you get an email saying like, "And you've planted a tree." That happened to me so many times while I was also watching this kind of controversy unfold, where some people are saying, "Let's plant trees," and this is a big climate solution. Other people are saying, "Not." So I really wanted to take an in-depth look at that. Yes, as a scientist and someone who's worked in this field and is knowledgeable in this field, but as a writer and storyteller and someone, really wanted to report to a greater depth
Mm.
on the question of to what extent can trees really save us and how.
Yeah, it's an important question because again, as you were saying, I mean, every now and then maybe there's a paper, or there's somebody of notoriety comes out and says something or whatever, and people will get very excited about the potential. And I mean, I think maybe some of these things start in a good place, but sometimes it's the picture's a little bit more complicated. I do think the narrative approach that you're doing is helpful. People think in narrative; it really resonates with people, and that's a different type of writing that's not easy to do in some ways. So I think that's I think that's great that you're tackling that because I mean, science communication is really 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 important, and I think people are seeing that now even more so as we get lots of different ideas out there that aren't always accurate. So good science communication is important.
Yeah, I
Um,
think, so many. I go back now and teach workshops every now and then at Stanford and
mm,
taught in some other programs. And I just think, there's so many interdisciplinary environmental, problem solving programs or even, universities that are bringing sustainability into, many different departments they have various ways. But I think the more we can train some of the experts themselves to be good communicators and storytellers,
mm, mm,
the more information get out there and the more chance we have to get that story right. You're not playing a game of telephone tag where you're
mm.
um, relaying to someone else who's then reporting from a different perspective. So it's not definitely not easy. In Search of the Canary Tree came out of my own journey, so I felt like I'd done research. There were stories I had to tell. I'd interviewed incredible people in these remote communities in Alaska, and I was really clear. I could see very clearly that there was a book. Whereas in this new project, Treekeepers, I had a question, that was really capturing my attention and felt important and feels important today. And, I had to take a really different perspective, or strategy, which was to really act as a reporter and be a reporter. And I went out and interviewed about 150 people around the world who were involved in uh, reforestation, restoration, tree planting. We could talk about all those different words there are for this.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
And a lot of different kinds of people.
hmm So I guess the kind of one big question here, I mean, we're sort of kind of, going around it a bit, but I guess directly here is why do you think people, like you said, both sides of the spectrum and, politically and otherwise, different interest groups, um, make such a big deal now about forests?
Yeah.
You know, how much, I mean, what's just generally, we'll just kind of dive into some of this. So we start general here on this is, I mean, what in a broad sense, how much can forests really save the planet or help to regenerate things or to create new things? How much of it is what's the bottom, I guess, or ceiling, whichever way you want to look at it, of what forests are actually able to do for the planet, for climate change, for carbon emission. As you said, there's it's not like a magic kind of pill of sorts where it's just like plant more trees and everything will be fine. Obviously, so what's the reality here? I guess on
Yeah.
planting lots of trees and expanding forests and all that. What's the real story here? I guess generally.
Great question. There's so much to unpack there. So I'm glad we have a little time.
Yeah. Go
But I
ahead.
will
Go ahead.
say, I started with that question of to what extent can trees or forests really save us? Because because of the climate interest and because of the ways in which so many people and governments and companies and leaders were standing up, putting this forward as a big climate solution. In reality, forests do so much more for our planet and life on this planet than just sequester carbon.
Mm,
And I'd love to spend a little time on that, but I'm going to start with just the climate one because that's where we started.
mhm,
Um, and so, the book takes a reader on a journey of the many ways in which forests support life on Earth and make our quality of life better. Through stories and through places I visit, through people I met. Um, but I do take a real critical look at what they do on the carbon front. Um, for those who don't know, like one of the main, distinguishing factors, or the main distinguishing factor between a tree and other plants, is its bole, and that bole, that trunk, is what sequesters a lot of carbon and stores a lot of carbon. They obviously
mm,
have an effect on carbon storage below ground, and we're just, scientists are still gaining better skills to be able to assess carbon storage below ground. But a lot of the estimates on what a forest or a tree stores is based on its biomass of that bole or that trunk.
really?
Um,
So it's not the tops of the trees with all the branches and leaves and all that. It's really at at,
I
at
mean, you'll include
the
that in a biomass estimate and a
okay.
refined
So it's
biomass
included. Okay.
estimate. Yeah, but a
Got
lot
it.
of, I mean, you can think of that as woody material that's like still part of the branch.
Huh.
But
Mm,
those giant trunks, that's where you're getting a lot of carbon stored. Um,
interesting.
and it's also, we can probably spend some time talking about what is a forest, but um,
Right.
the line
Does
even
it
between
does
what is a tree and not a tree is not super
sort of what I was
precise,
going to
but is
ask. Yeah.
often based on tree height as well as having a woody bole, like that really
Yeah,
connected woody
I was
trunk.
gonna ask, is the size of the tree matter here in terms of like if you think of like the big redwoods out in Northern California, but what about really small trees that, don't have as wide a base or something like that, or they don't have as much, does that the
There's usually
size or the
like
volume?
scientists have to put a cutoff on it, a threshold, if you will. So there's usually a
Interesting.
diameter of like an inch or a few
Mm,
centimeters, and then a tree height that's not that impressive at all, but it just distinguishes it from a shrub or from
uh,
from smaller plants that don't have that woody bowl. Um,
so
but
does it
anyhow,
become does the size and the volume and number of trees make a difference in terms of reducing carbon emission or all these other things, or is it really not that kind of, direct of
oh,
an
for sure. I
equation
mean,
here?
the density of the wood is a huge factor on what's stored. So there are these equations that are species specific to estimate what a what a forest can store. So, wow, we're going to get in the weeds here, but there's all kinds of methods from using like remote sensing methods, so you're looking at an aerial image and saying, okay, this area is forest, then you put a forest type on it and you come up with like a general estimate of what the carbon stored could be versus, Jean-Francois Bastin, who I write about. He was the first author on this global potential study. Before doing that work, he had spent time in the Congo, and he went out there and ID'd all the species in a certain area, and then measured them and came up with different and then applied like very species specific estimates to estimate the carbon stored in that forest, and that's getting down to like much finer detail from ground based inventory in a forest than what you could estimate from a remotely sensed image or a photograph. But all these, uh, what the media picked up and what, some even oil executives started to put forward was like, this is the solution from let's plant more trees. And that had a lot of backlash. The authors of that study, were critiqued and lashed out at on various social media platforms, and scientists submitted, comments because they were worried that people would stop saying we need to reduce emissions and start saying like we just need to plant trees instead. In reality, the big answer is we need both. We need first and foremost, we need emissions reductions. We need to protect the standing forests that still exist in this world. And then, we can get more from growing more trees and yes, planting some too. And also, we need a suite of other solutions. It's a whole portfolio. But to answer your question on what do forests do, so, in recent years, humans across the planet, have emitted about 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide or exist in a year. And our existing forests, so those that are, relatively intact and just doing their thing, still standing, absorb about a third of those emissions on an annual basis, so about 12 gigatons. That's what our forests are already doing. Then if you talk about increasing that forest cover, we could probably get that up to about a half. So there is a lot more potential for what forests could do. But the other complexity here is that it doesn't just come from planting a tree. There's been research that I talk about in the end of the book, coming out of the same lab group, showing that about 60% of this work could come from just growing those existing forests. So the many forests around the world still have potential to continue taking up more carbon and doing more good work just by growing. So let's keep them and let them grow more. And then, another 40% could come from creating new forests via various ways that we'll probably talk about today. Afforestation, reforestation, like big projects, small projects in urban areas. Yeah.
I'm gonna come to definitions in a second. This is something that's jumping out to me. This might sound like a strange, I mean, maybe not to you, but maybe to listeners, a strange question. But I've had some conversations about the, it's still, experimental, exploratory, kind of research, and it's hard to do these studies, although some have been done on the kind of potential, sentience and or intelligence of plants and or other organisms. Doesn't it feel, just as you were saying this, is well, we're emitting all of this carbon, we're using all of this in such a very, very hyper speed amount, in a year, and it grows and all these things, and we have a lot of waste, and humans are doing lots of that on the planet. Um, and a footnote here, we'll come to maybe just as a longer kind of offshoot here, no pun intended, on the Carboniferous on the Carboniferous period, which there have been periods of the Earth, of course, that emit carbon, things like that naturally. But I mean, I think the big distinction with humans is how much and how such a short of time and how detrimental that is. Evolution doesn't like things very rapidly, typically, although there's exceptions. So anyways, but if you just plant trees, it does feel, I mean, I'm sort of making a moral valence here, but it sort of feels not okay to use trees just so we can emit more carbon. Like, in some ways, that's what
Okay,
it
so
feels like, right?
yeah, but that's going at offsets. Like, are we restoring forests? And by the way, we're in this period now for this decade called the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. First time
Mhm.
in the history of humankind where people have come together all around the planet, like supported by the UN to restore ecosystems. That's not just forests.
Sure,
Um,
yeah.
but I think that uh, the question is, are you restoring a forest or planting a forest or growing a forest to give yourself permission to emit somewhere else? So I'd love to talk about carbon offset. Or are you also, there's plenty of efforts around the world that are restoring a forest or planting a forest, growing a forest for a suite of benefits. Carbon is just one of them. But when you get down to offsets, that's when it gets a little tricky. I also want
Mhm,
to point
mhm,
out, like we're still just talking about the climate solution, so we definitely have to circle back to all the other ways that forests support life. Um,
mhm,
but
mhm, mhm,
we get, I think, a lot of people, myself included, get caught up in the carbon, um,
mhm.
whereas methane and other gases are major
Sure.
contributors to the problem too. So even if, let's just say, in the magical world we even fix the carbon piece, there's a huge methane piece as well as other gases
Mhm,
that we're going to require different solutions.
mm,
Methane has caused about a third of the warming to date.
mm.
And carbon is at about half of that, or half of the warming to date. Um, so it's a multi-prong. There's many contributors to the problem, and there's many solutions for each contributor. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Just tell me really quick, just on a technical thing. You don't have to spend too much time on this, but some people might be surprised about this, but a lot of the data we get on forests is satellite imaging that NASA does, right? I think this is the Earth
Yeah.
Resources Technology Satellite. And, things like that. I mean, obviously what are the ways in which we get the data on forest, the reduction of forest or how we could, potentially grow more forest, things like that. What's the sources of where we're getting our data? You could talk about satellite imaging from NASA. You could talk about other ways, but, where's the way, what are the ways we're getting our data on kind of forests?
I love this question, and I'm definitely going to get kind of geeky on this, but let me
Go
try
ahead.
and
Go
make
ahead.
it a clear story. um, I mean, I think I got interested because I started with this question of like, okay, or I started with this interest in the countries that were experiencing some reversal in forest cover. So China, Bhutan, Costa
Hmm.
Rica,
Yep.
Vietnam. These are countries that stood out as, if you just look at their forest cover. Again, that's not what the forest is, in its complexity and diversity or the species there, but just the presence of a forest. Those countries were increasing and have been increasing forest cover. So then I said, well, for a reader needs to know, how do we look at the state of the world's forests in general? And it was a really
Yeah.
fun topic to research and to dig at in various ways. Um, since 1948, FAO has published what's called a global forest resource assessment, and that comes from different kinds of data sets at the country level. Countries actually opt in and submit the data that they have, and it provides estimates of forest cover around the world. Now, different countries also, define what a forest is differently. If you can think of, here we are in like the Pacific Northwest, and imagine a redwood forest or um, some of the pine forests here, really different than a mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia that may have, a strip of forest along a riverway.
Mm,
So, those countries have come up with definitions of forest and ways of determining, is this forest or not?
mhm,
That then has to go into a global database to somehow, you know, one universal variable report of like forest math.
mm,
Um, so that's kind of been the traditional way. And again, that's not, if you think 1948 or the 40s being the earliest data sets, that's not that far back, really.
right.
but the more advanced technology that that is used, and is considered more reliable, in some ways because it's produced by a satellite, by a machine, by computers assessing in the same way around the world on satellite. Um, and I started thinking, well, from a storytelling perspective, like, learning about remote sensing is pretty difficult. I want to go back to, what was the first satellite uh, that made data publicly available, and what was its story? And I came across this woman, Virginia Norwood. She was incredible. She was 95 years old when I visited her, and she is the woman who invented the sensor in Landsat 1. It was the
Mm,
first public first satellite launched by the U.S. government with the explicit monitor mission to monitor uh, the Earth's surface, and eventually to make that data public. There had been, obviously some earlier satellites used various defense for various defense purposes, but Landsat changed the world,
mm,
and changed our view of it. I think of it now like my child knows what the surface of the Earth looks like.
mhm,
You think of that as this thing we know, and you
mm,
can just close your eyes and picture it. But in really, we didn't have that in the human mind, as in any time before 1972,
mm,
which is kind of wild. Um, Anyhow, within days of the launch of this satellite, which is orbiting the Earth, it gave people the ability to monitor real time what was happening. It's taking, sequential images, like a time series, and creating a time series, capturing around, the entire Earth's surface, um, on a multi-day cycle. So you get the beauty of being able to document change. So for the first time in human history, people could remotely look at fires, for example, and say, like, how much has burned in the last X number of days. It had all kinds of applications immediately. You could monitor agricultural crops. You could look at, they've been used in early on. People started figuring out you could measure the depths of the oceans through it. It discovered islands that people didn't even know about. There's an island somewhere up, off the coast of Canada, I think. It's called Landsat Island, because it
mm,
was one that was discovered, soon after the
mm,
birth
mm,
of the satellite. And since then, obviously, technology has improved. Probably many people are familiar with drones. In a high end carbon project where people are monitoring a forest and assessing, are there all those trees surviving year after year? There's now new tools like drones that can help with that. Um, but the data that came from the Landsat program and other satellites that launched after really made global forest monitoring possible. We could document loss and gain.
mm,
Now, it's really fun. Open it up, click around, go to Global Forest Watch. It's a great platform and is the most accessible one that anyone can look at the whole world and see forest loss and gain, from 2001 to 2020, more recent
mm,
data, 2023. Um, and it's, there are tools in the Amazon that group also uses to monitor, real-time deforestation
mm,
remotely.
mm, mm.
So it's
Yeah,
really revolutionized, how we could study and assess the state of the world's forests. But it also, if you just look at the data from a satellite, you can paint a picture of, lose forest loss and gain, or if you push it to a global statistic and say, well, we haven't actually lost that much forest cover in the last number of decades. We're losing in the tropics and we're gaining in some areas like boreal
mm,
regions, but those
mm,
forests are really different ecosystems.
mhm,
And so
mhm,
you can't
mhm,
just swap one for the other.
mhm. Yeah, I think obviously, when people think of NASA and satellites, they think of, the sexy images that the telescopes give,
Yeah.
or, the fun projects like going to Mars or the moon and all that, which is, those are fun. I mean, But or all the rovers we send, or the things we send to some of the certain moons or whatever in Jupiter or Saturn. But the one thing that is really important and terribly instructive with NASA and satellites is how much of Earth we understand and know and realize from satellites that help us with many, many, many different things, which
Oh,
is
it's incredible what you can
super,
do.
super important.
You can distinguish crops now. Like even
Hmm.
when I was sitting in Virginia's living room, we had this incredible archive of materials from her very long, impressive career. And the image that stands out in my mind is not the one I describe in the book, but is this test image of different plants. There was like broccoli and some
Oh
various
wow.
herbs from gardens. They'd taken
Hmm.
the sensor out and taken pictures of it to see, like, does this have a spectral signature? So that's like, what does a
Mm,
sensor capture that's different for
mm,
these plants? I was like, whoa,
mm.
this was the
That's
birth
super
of like
cool.
the really cool stuff.
Yeah, that's really cool. That is really, really cool to see that. Yeah. So let's talk definitions a little bit, because I mean it's important, and probably most people don't think about this. So I certainly didn't. So in reading the book, I was like, oh yeah, that's actually different, and there's some just important distinctions here. So the big one: what is a forest? How do we define a forest from a not forest? Right? What's a forest? And then here you can also get into afforestation and reforestation, and what the differences are there. We can also talk about forest transitions if you want here. So yeah, start us off with, how do we define a forest? What's a forest? And then some of these other terms.
Okay, great. Well, this is good that we're following it, in conversation of the satellite discussion,
Mm. Hmm.
because there are about 800 definitions of what a forest is in the scientific literature.
Oh my
But if you
goodness.
think of like one satellite circling around the planet, or a number of satellites circling, trying to take data consistently and then say, this is forest or this is not forest, you actually need one global definition.
Right. I would imagine so.
So there is, in the studies that work off remote sense data to assess where forest is and is not, uses a universal definition. Um, that definition is usually based on a canopy cover and and an area with trees that have a certain height.
Mm.
Um, so that means you're imposing this threshold, and it obviously won't capture anything. Well, sorry, it obviously won't capture everything. There will be some forest that lies outside of what that definition is. And I thought I took kind of a deep dive on it and share some stories of where the terms come from and the different definitions we've had, and we do have, but they're not poetic or spiritual or cultural. They have largely been used to be able to measure where they are in their presence.
Mm.
Um, I think, well, something stands out from actually my time in Alaska when I was interviewing people there about healthy forests. This appears in Search of the Canary Tree, but there was a ecologist I met, and I asked him what is a forest to him, and he said, after all these years, a healthy forest is a feeling, and that still resonates with me. But
Mm.
obviously, a satellite, circling the planet is not going to go off that.
Hmm. That's right. Yeah.
But forest comes from the Latin word forest, which means outside. Forest,
Mm.
Forestus silva literally means wood outside.
Huh.
A forest is one or more stands managed together under a single ownership or a single certificate. A forest is a biological community dominated by trees and other wooded plants. Um, different countries in the country level data that I was talking about, when they submit reports saying this is what our country has, uses different thresholds for forest cover. So, in Russia, or a canopy cover might be 30 to 40%, or in South Africa up to 60%. Um, so again, that's like this wide range. But if you look at the universal definition that most global assessments that work remotely sense data are using, it's super nerdy. It says a forest is land spanning more than zero point 0.5 hectares with trees higher than 5 meters and a canopy cover of more than 10%.
Hmm.
So that's a pretty low threshold, 10%.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if I give an example here, you'll appreciate this. So I've been to the Lewis and Clark National Forest in Montana. It's absolutely
Hmm.
gorgeous. It's very, very nice. Like that has a start point and an end point for somebody's definition, right? Like for me, this is a very simple thing. For me, a forest seems to be a lot of trees, and then there's a point where there are no trees.
Yeah.
And so whatever that region is, you want to call it a thing, cool. And maybe that might be, there might be big forest or small forest, but there's enough that it is a forest, and I can literally walk where there are no trees, and then I go into trees, and then I come out of trees. Like that's like I'm just very concrete about this.
Totally.
But maybe that's not, because I'm thinking
But
of
that's the
trees.
threshold, right? So, but just now imagine close your eyes and imagine 60%. Like if you look up at the sky and 60% of it is covered by the canopy,
Mhm,
that's one threshold. But in
mhm,
another definition of forest, you could look up and see, oh, only 10%. There's a few scattered trees here, but this is still a forest. So
mhm,
that threshold really matters. One of the I spent some time researching urban forestry. Was a fascinating chapter to research. Some really interesting stories to share. But as someone who has spent most of my time, well, at least when I was doing research in relatively remote, intact forests, we're thinking like dense canopy above you. The idea of the urban forest is like, whoa, really? That
mhm,
a whole urban expanse could be an urban forest when you then consider the trees down, various streets. Maybe they hit 10, 20% cover the green spaces in it. That is a forest, just a very different kind of forest.
mhm, mhm. What's the difference, I guess, here, if there is one? Maybe I'm just going to make this more complicated, but and again, these are all, I guess, somewhat arbitrary, but there is, I'm assuming, some sort of taxonomy here for important purposes. But what's the distinction between like a forest and a wilderness, and then a
Mm,
wilderness and a forest from like a jungle? So like I've been to the Amazon, dense canopy, the whole
hmm.
thing. There's ways in which you make distinctions there, and it's like, okay, like that's. I mean, obviously, it's a different part of the world. There's different types of plants. There's different types of ecosystems. It's very biodiverse. That's different than when I was in Costa Rica, and that's different from when I was in Montana. But they all have some threshold, right? So, I mean, how do we see the distinctions here between those things?
Different words. If you think of the forest definition, largely based on the canopy cover, the density of trees, or tree height, or some combination of them. Wilderness actually tends to be a land designation. So in the U.S.,
Mm,
we have national protected areas, and then we have wilderness areas, and other countries have wilderness areas. And that just means it just regulates differently what people can and can't do in that wilderness, and a wilderness may or
mm,
may not be a forest. Jungle,
okay.
on the other hand, is like thinking about, or often used as a common description of a tropical, relatively intact, highly biodiverse forest.
Mm,
Um, so, wet, also, humid, wet ecosystem.
mm,
Um, there are, I spent time in dry tropical forests in Panama, which I wrote about.
mhm,
We'll call that a jungle as well, but it's typically
mhm,
applied to the very biodiverse forests that tend to exist across the equatorial region.
mhm, mhm. Okay, yeah, that's helpful. So
But we should talk
tell us
about
about. I was gonna say, yeah.
reforestation. Oh
Tell us
my
about this.
gosh.
Yeah, so people talk about like reforestation is the thing that people talk about a lot, but
Yeah,
there is a distinction between I mean, if you think about it literally, to reforest something is to put it back to where something
right.
was, is what it was. But afforestation is a little bit different. Yeah, what are the distinctions here between these, and how do people kind of get it a little mixed up?
And I don't think they're terms that people think about in the general public. And they
Mm,
also, have been highlighted by scientists around the controversy of reforestation or growing trees or planting new trees because the question is, are you restoring a forest that was forest recently. So perhaps some degradation happened by natural causes or land clearing. Then you're reforesting a forest that was recently forest versus expanding forest into other areas where it
Mm,
hasn't recently been forest as
mhm,
afforestation. And
mm,
when that 2019 study came out, there was a line in the article saying it's just one or two sentences, that obviously that grasslands and other ecosystems had been excluded. They weren't suggesting that we should go into other valuable ecosystems and plant trees, but that was something that caught other scientists by alarm, saying, "Well, where should these trees go? We don't, other ecosystems are valuable. We shouldn't just be planting trees wherever and making everything forest."
mm,
The argument was obviously more complex than that, but that's that's the summary.
mm.
Um, yeah, so reforestation, planting a forest on land that was recently forest, and afforestation, uh, planting a forest in an area that was not. And again, what's the cutoff?
Mm,
Most of the time, people are using, I think it's an FAO definition again, 50 years.
mm,
So if a forest had been, um, if a land had forest at 49 years, and then you plant it again, that would be reforesting. And if it was at 51 years, that would be afforesting. So the threshold,
Interesting.
like everything around the threshold is messy. But it was fascinating. Like in the UK, for example, I spent some time there visiting some of the earliest carbon certified projects in Scotland. Um, but so much of the UK was forest long ago that people there really commonly used the word afforestation because it was 100 or 200 years ago that it was forest.
Mm,
So in the mind of it's not in anyone's lived experience that that a lot of that land was recently forest.
interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting.
And it's
Tell,
an important distinction for to show because of the land use history, because of the idea that not the idea, let me correct myself, and because of the fact that other ecosystems have value, it can be used as an indicator of, are we restoring this? Are we recreating what was there, or are we totally shifting this ecosystem into something new?
mm,
Um, and then, the third, not to like lay all these complicated terms on it. I think I do it pretty well through story in the book, but it is hard when we're
yeah,
like,
yeah.
hey, let's just do it right now and like let's do definitions. Is restoration? What kind of restoration are you talking? Are
Yeah.
you restoring what was previously on that land, like the species that were there, or are you um, creating a forest that may be more likely to survive in the future, and perhaps it has, different species than the ones that were most recently there.
Mm,
There's a whole
mm,
range of restoration we could talk about.
mm. Yeah, tell us a bit about you mentioned in the book of forced transition. You talked about some of this stuff in various European countries. I think maybe Scotland was one of them. If you want to get real nerdy, you can talk about the Mather's depletion melioration model here, which I actually enjoyed reading. It was very interesting. I like kind of like all the data points. So if you want to talk about that, you can talk about that here too. So
Well, I really liked going back to some of the, first or some of the leaders in various aspects of the story. So, in remote sensing, let's go back to Virginia, the first person who helped who helped make that possible. And, here I was really interested in this transition from a world that is losing its forest to one that might be gaining more forest. And I wanted to
mm,
look at, the researchers and people who have studied that at the country level. There was a Scottish geographer named Alexander Mather. I didn't meet. He died in 2006. Um, but he was someone who put forward this term forest transition, which is essentially that a shift from at the national level from losing forest to gaining forest. Obviously,
mm,
what that forest is can be different if you're losing primary forest or relatively intact old growth and plantation for timber. Really different. Um, but he was looking at what drives people to do that and what has driven um, some countries to do that in history, largely in Europe. And one of the figures that he put forward, and it's really simple. It's just it's basically like two hills, and there's a little
Hmm.
valley in between, and the second hill is smaller than the first hill. Um, and he basically says in that valley, your resource extent, represents how much you have of your resources. Your resource extent is going too low, too low, too low. So people are driven to some kind of crisis where they want to do things differently. And that's where, after World War I or World War II, countries would implement new forest policies because they didn't want to be dependent on timber imports from somewhere else. So they started reforesting to create, their own plantations in some countries in Europe. But he calls that, that middle area, this crisis amelioration, or it's the idea that like we're in crisis and we want to do something differently. And I liked the these two hills and this little valley in between, and this line for the crisis. I liked thinking about it in this modern era because now we're responding out of a different crisis. We're worried about, many people are worried about climate change. Many people are worried about biodiversity collapse. Many people are worried about continued forest loss that we read about in the Amazon and Congo and elsewhere. Um, what can we do differently? Could we do something different? And I kind of use that as a way to, put a mark on this moment in time that perhaps we may see some other reversal, a global reversal in our forest cover. And those forests may not be exactly what they were, but they may be something new that can still provide benefits into the future.
Let's I guess go back in time. I guess about many people will say that the Earth has evolved over billions of years, and there's been times where there's been less forests, more carbon, less carbon naturally. And one period that people point to, I think it's somewhere before or after the fourth extinction. I can't quite remember, but it's a period of the Earth. It's pre-Jurassic and Jurassic period. It's the Carboniferous period. Um, and so, yeah, this is a time where there was a lot of, carbon on the planet. And, for, you know, mammals probably, and definitely humans probably couldn't survive on the planet during this period. And a lot of animals probably couldn't. But, and from what I think we understand is that, our ecology was different on the planet, things like that. But what's the important lesson, I guess, to learn from the Carboniferous period? Like, obviously the Earth was different, but there was all of this carbon being emitted. But how is that different now on the planet? Obviously, we're talking millions of years, at least years later, in terms of scale and speed and things like that. But what was the big thing you were trying to point to by mentioning the
Yeah,
Carboniferous
great
period?
question. Well, I think, you've touched upon it, but everyone knows about the Jurassic, right? Dinosaurs capture our minds and attention as little kids. Um, when I was researching this chapter and period and this time called the Carboniferous, I always outline things on the wall, and I had these drawings of all these forests, and my son
Hmm.
was totally captivated. I have a 6-year-old boy. They look like
Hmm.
Dr. Seuss forests, which is
Hmm.
appealing to everyone, the truffle trees. But carbo,
Lorax, yeah, yeah.
yeah, the
Hmm.
Lorax, that's right.
Hmm.
Carbo, coal, farrow to bear. The Carboniferous is coal bearing or carbon bearing. And I write about this period in time because it's proof positive that trees can sequester or lock up carbon for very, very, very long periods of time. So these were trees like copsids. There were others, but I'm just going to talk about those for right now. They're called arborescent copsids. They're members of the oldest vascular plants. These are, they're like green stalks that stood like colossal asparagus spears on a swampy landscape. They could reach over 100 feet tall. They were 6 feet in diameter in the base. They only reproduced once in their lives, so scientists think. They didn't offer much shade. If you imagine, like, what we think of a forest today, they grew, 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 and then their crowns kind of unfolded and unfurled in their old and dying days. Um, and they were, they had the most magnificent canopies in their dying years, basically,
Mm, mm,
in their dying time.
mm,
Anyhow, these trees. Um, so now we're going to rewind that just back in time, and it's so hard to even think on these numbers. But we're talking about between 330 and 260 million years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, this Carboniferous period, it was the highest rate of global organic carbon burial that occurred, to the best of our knowledge. So, you know, the coal that we later discovered and have burned and continue to burn, and it's contributed to our global warming and our global climate crisis, came from those trees. Really wild to imagine that we've come this full circle, really, from these trees that were buried and stored carbon underground, became coal. We discovered it, we burned it. And now, millions and millions of years later, many people are saying, well, let's plant trees, let's grow more trees because we want them to we want them to fix the problem. We want them to store the carbon again. We want them to draw it down. For about 9 million of those years in that window, the bark of these lycopsid trees was the single biggest contributor to what became coal. Really wild.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a, impressive, uh, alluring, strange period in time when, lands that were separate today were contiguous in the megacontinent Pangea. If you think of these continents basically banging together, you've got
Mm-hmm.
mountains you're creating and then swamps that are swamps and valleys. And um, when these trees fell down, and again, like it's really easy in the human mind to say, like, oh, they all fell down at once and like created a big coal deposit. No, this is like so slow happening
Mm-hmm.
over millions of years, where these trees get buried in those cold, in the wet, swampy conditions that are really perfect for preservation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's a short chapter. I think it's only like 1,200 words or so in the book, but it was, brings the reader and myself back to this story of where the coal came from, and it came from our trees, and now we're turning to trees again, and we do know they can lock up carbon and they can store carbon for millions of years. Could they do it again? Could they do it again on a new scale?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have a strange fascination with the ecological kind of record and the whole time period, the periods of the Earth. It's a very interesting thing for me how we organize it. What you're talking about. When I read the chapter, I was thinking about a long time ago now, but so it's been years now. I can't remember when. It's early on when I was doing the podcast, but I had a great conversation with Patrick Roberts. He's out in Europe. I can't remember where now. I don't know where he's at now. But he wrote a really cool book called Jungle, and
Huh.
he talks about how tropical forests shape the world or whatever the subtitle is. And but he talks a lot about angiosperms and how that were super important
Mm.
for how we see the world today. And it was really, really, really fascinating. So we talk a bit about the Carboniferous period. We talk about
Mm.
um, Pangea and Gondwana, or whatever the other
Mm-hmm.
a bit of it is early on. And yeah, I think we talk about reforestation and things like that. So, but it is interesting to understand these things now today in context of how the Earth has been doing things for a long time. And so I 1,200 words or not, I did enjoy that chapter. It was a good chapter. So it's a good
Yeah,
context.
I agree with you too. It's just hard for the human mind to think back on the timescales too, and imagine then, like, evolutionary processes and all the things that are changing over millions of years. Part of
Hmm.
my
Hmm.
own part of my other fascination with these trees, so these lycopsids,
Hmm.
have very tiny relatives today. So despite the
Mm,
fact they were these colossal, trees back then,
mm,
the members we have that are their relatives are called club mosses, these big
mm,
stems. And when I worked in Alaska, we would do these. We were doing a field-based inventory, spending lots of time measuring trees in a forest and also IDing all the plants. And for the club mosses, you have to get down on your like, hands and knees and see these tiny little things. And and now, with the context of this being like the last tiny relative of these, or
mhm,
among the last tiny
mhm,
relatives of these trees that I don't know directed the course of human history that we're still
mhm.
carving and creating, in many ways. It's wild.
Yeah, it helps. I think it's the context is certainly essential to bear in mind. So
I also
the other
like
thing
that one of the experts I interviewed called the lycopsid bark the plastic of its day. That it was just this thing that like kept accumulating and
it's
nobody
a
could
funny
do
way to say it.
anything with
Yeah,
it, you know?
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a funny way to say
It's
it.
like, couldn't get rid of it, but it was there. Like,
um, you also mentioned the land gap reports, so you can get into
Mhm.
this. About the restorative continuum from Society of Ecological Restoration, and how does the ecological recovery wheel help us understand forest restoration? So yeah, just I'll give you a runway here. Tell us about the land gap report and some of the essential features and why it's important. So tell us what it is, but then why it's important.
Well, I think the story and like why go to the land gap report? Like that sounds. Let's start with it. It sounds intimidating. I'm intimidated already. um, no, and I mean, I think when this idea or this directive or this dream, however you want to phrase it, per trillion trees, hit the planet and continues to capture people's attention. Um, the obvious response is where are those trees going to go? Where are those trees coming from?
Mm,
And we've already talked about a little bit, a trillion trees, hoping for a trillion trees more is not planting a trillion trees. It is some forests naturally recovering. It is, a majority of forests, 60% of that trillion, coming from forests that continue to stand because that continue to live and grow and reproduce. And, then yes, creating more. Um, but around the time that this was taking hold, 2022, there was a report that came out around the time COP, um,
mm,
which was in Egypt that year, and it was essentially looking at the land needed to meet the pledges that were already made. So,
mm,
you know, countries and companies were standing up saying, "Let's plant this number of trees," or a country would say, "I am committed to X number, and it will sequester this amount of carbon, and we're therefore contributing to the climate crisis by this method." And the point of the report was that, all these commitments and countries' pledges were relying upon an unrealistic amount of land. That that 1.2, or 1 billion hectares of land is more than the current global cropland. Um, so it points to, you know, well, it makes a few key points, and it's relevant for a few reasons. One is that countries can make commitments, but it's local communities and local people that keep trees in a given place, and there has to be um, an incentive for that. They have to be drawing livelihoods from from places, and can't just come in from the outside and say trees go here. Um, and also, it points to the what I take as like a hopeful and optimistic message, in that we need trees integrated into various land uses. It's not just we're taking 1 billion hectares around the land and like changing it immediately to forest.
mm,
That's not the mission, and it's not a realistic one if it is.
mm, mm, mm. This might be helpful to talk about here because I mean it's interesting when you start getting different types of governments and you get certain types of businesses and you get all these people involved about understanding what are the things we can do here. One of the things that becomes pretty salient pretty quickly is incentive structures. So maybe you can.
Mhm.
There's a whole lot of things here. I had a wonderful conversation again a couple of years ago with Christian Run. I'm
Mm.
butchering that last name, and he has this company. I can't remember the name. I can look it up, but um, where it's Innovate something like that. I can't remember, but he talked a lot. We talked a lot about carbon offsets and carbon accounting and what is the ways in which people. I mean, he's kind of like on the front lines of working with companies and in some countries that are doing this. But from your perspective, I mean, what do you feel are some of the incentive structures here, right? So we all hear about we hear the big report, we hear about comp, we hear about these big kind of things with world leaders and with countries, but you know a lot of the times this really is going to come down to incentives and how we do things. So in terms of with
Hmm.
with trees, what do you feel about some of these kind of carbon accounting and offsets and things like that? What's your kind of vantage point on this?
Yeah, we'll just give a quick uh, summary for people that aren't be familiar even with
Hmm.
what it is. But essentially, we've talked a lot about the carbon stored in the bowl of a tree or in below ground, however you want to measure it, the woody mass. Um, you could come up with an estimate for how much a forested area is storing in terms of carbon. And then if we think about, putting a value on that, so you pay for a ton of carbon and creating a credit system out of it.
Mm.
So if I'm a company, you can offset your emissions. It's essentially like permission, basically saying like, I'm not going to reduce my emissions in my own business right here. Instead, I'm going to have this forest in X country, say Guatemala. That's a good example of the first project. Um, and they're going to, those trees that I grew or those trees that I protected are going to offset my emissions.
Mm.
And the tricky part of this, when you, well, I mean, there's so many things that are tricky. So I did this bullet points. Let me just take a few highlights here. The
Yes.
first
Yeah.
one is, how are you measuring that? And is it accurate?
Hmm.
How are you monitoring that to the future?
Hmm.
But the part that's like really critical, if you're thinking of this work as a climate fix or a way to reduce, is like, is the offset really an exact offset? When
Mm.
the idea came up, years ago, and this was some of the cool history that I went into, decades, you know, we were thinking that, well, carbon I emit is the carbon I emit in one if the carbon emit that I emit in one place is the same as what I suck up somewhere else on the planet,
Mm.
then great, let's do it. Let's trade, and this could be an efficient system um, for making uh, for and this could be an efficient system for making removals.
Mm.
But it gets complicated because, well, how is the measurement? Is the measurement accurate? And also, what we emit into the atmosphere already puts some change in motion. And,
Mm.
this gets really in the weeds, but there's some studies showing that basically, like, the warming effect of what we emit is not necessarily the same as the uh, cooling or mediating effect of what we remove. Essentially, it's like if you put something in the atmosphere, it's going to start having trickle down effects and changing things before you suck it up somewhere else. Um, so it's not a perfect swap, even if we could measure it perfectly.
Mm.
All that said, I think that, you know, there are lots of initiatives around the world that are restoring forests or planting new forests of different kinds that will have some benefits coming from this financial incentive, which is essentially a company or someone, yeah, a company pursuing that credit.
Mm.
Once you use the credit, it's like nobody else can use it. You retired it. So
Mhm.
if you're in a system that's regulated, and that's where it gets another level of complication is that in the initial vision of what this system could be like, there would be a global cap and trade. It's like the world would say, this is how much we can emit. So then we're going to trade. And eventually we're only going to have some of these offsets happening in some places. And it'll force people to stop using fossil fuels. There are examples of, in the US of having done this successfully with other cap and trade systems. But
Mhm.
we didn't get that model. It's now what's called a voluntary market. So companies and governments can say, like, this is what I'm going to do for climate change here without some global regulation around it.
Mm.
The UK, and this is part of the reason why I spent some time in the UK, like, they have their own carbon code where they're certifying carbon projects, but it has to go towards companies that are emitting in the UK. You can't be like, a country, you can't be offsetting outside the UK. You're making the offset from change that's happening in the UK. And I actually think that's a better model because you've got a more aggressive goal that you're then going to set regulations on, and you're going to force change within your country. And if we had been able to do this at a global scale, like maybe the story would have been different. But in the end, what we got was this voluntary system of companies saying, "Hey, I want to hit net zero," or countries saying, "I'm going to do
Mm-hmm.
something aggressively." And some of that is coming from reducing the amount their emissions via innovation, other methods. And some of them are coming from removals, these trades, offsets that come from changes elsewhere.
Mm.
And it's not an equal swap.
Yeah. Well, as listeners can
Feel free
hear, I
to
mean,
unpack anything there. I just try, like, I downloaded a
no, no,
lot.
no, no, no. I mean, I think it is a complicated system, right? Because it's not like a one to one. You're not dealing with,
Right.
it's not like you know, you go to the store, there's an item, you give money, and then you get the item. Like it's just not, it's not exactly like that. And people are, well, the things on the earth, but people are not static. We're always moving and we're doing things. And so it just, it's a complicated kind of thing. I think there's a lot of potential for it. And I don't stay close to this kind of research, but I think that it has to have a lot of flexibility. And the other thing that also becomes a big challenge here is, you might have a company or you might have an area that can do some of this well, but things like this, and it is important to do it at this level. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but as soon as you start to scale things, it just becomes exponentially more difficult at scale. So something might work in a microcosm, it might work in one space, but then, what is the entire country of China doing? The entire United States, it's just like very hard to do that. So again, I mean, I think you're just highlighting a lot of the complexities of this. Not to say it's bad or that we shouldn't do it. It's
Yeah.
just it's complicated.
And to point to, your question began with incentives. I think of them as funding mechanisms like restoration work, reforestation work, planting trees, growing trees. We have to make keeping trees economically viable.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
to do that, you need you need a portfolio of funding mechanisms. Carbon credits are one of them.
Yeah.
Biodiversity credits won't have the same offsetting situation, but that may be another, doing really good work in a place that restores biodiversity and getting um, putting some money toward that. Um, so there's also, obviously a huge space for philanthropy and this work. But then there's public money, the public
Mm.
money that comes from governments that, goes towards forest management, goes towards biodiversity in various ways. In the United States, under the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act put forward $1.5 billion to increase, largely to increase forest cover in um, communities that are disproportionately affected by climate and other and 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 have other that are disproportionately affected by climate and have other uh, challenges they're facing. So this is
Mm.
an act going to support tree cover in urban communities.
Mm.
Those $1.5 billion more than what carbon credits would do for urban forests are doing. So
Hmm.
while carbon credits and forest carbon credits have gotten a lot of media attention um, for the good and the bad,
Yeah.
there are other mechanisms,
Mm.
but we still need to see more investment in forests than what we
Hmm.
currently have.
Hmm. Yeah. So two final things here. You can kind of fuse them together if you want. But what do you think about ecosystem services and really understanding this relationship between nature and people? And I guess just kind of finally is, what do you feel is, next 10, 15, 25, 50 years, what is a promising future for forests and how humans interact with forests on the planet?
Yeah. So ecosystem services, I think it's one of the kind of inaccessible terms like biodiversity a little bit. People are like, how do I put my finger on that? Um, but ecosystem services are essentially the services that we as a people and another life draw from nature. Um, and what I do love about it in application or the way in which it's being used is that I think it points out the many ways we need nature and a functioning nature
Mm,
to sustain our lives. So there's anything from provisioning services like supplying wood and pollination and the food we grow, um, to ecosystem functioning, to the ways in which it like a functioning ecosystem. Sorry, to ecosystem functioning um, to our climate systems and our weather systems and anyhow, it's when you start to disrupt that balance, we lose those services. I point to Aldo Leopold here, who's one who said, we tinker. The first important part of tinkering is we keep all the parts. You know, so it's the unraveling of when we start to degrade that we lose those services. But what I find hopeful in the use of ecosystem services has been, trying to put an economic value on them. And that's certainly harder for ones like cultural ecosystem services, like what people draw from their spiritual time, from the effect on their mental health of spending time in nature. And those are harder to quantify and to put a value on. But something like pollination, pollination supports our agricultural businesses. Like you can put a dollar amount on that, and it's
mm,
very, very, very high. And when
mm,
you start to put the dollar amount, in our current economic system that really governs our way of life, um, you take away or you stop the habit of nature being this externality. You
mm,
think of all the riverways that have been um, polluted or various ways in which we've negatively impacted the environment as an externality to our daily lives. But
mm,
when you put this ecosystem, well, I'll put all the ecosystem services in the system, in our way of even calculating our gross domestic product, then it's no longer an externality. It's no longer this forgotten thing. You have to take care of it.
mm,
So there are a lot of countries now that are including an evaluation of their services from their functioning ecosystems in their gross domestic product, and that could lead to in the
mm,
future.
mm. And
Um,
forests
we
more
didn't touch
generally?
about it today, but well, I was gonna yeah, forest. We didn't talk about it so much today, but part of what I really love researching about urban forests is, in urban forests, people are coming in contact with trees. It's just the sheer number of people come in contact with trees in urban settings is so much more than even our remote one. That a lot of the benefits become clear or fascinating to take a look at in that setting. Um, there's a lot of uh, research showing the cooling effect that trees have in urban areas. So, in Portland, for example, a well canopied neighborhood could be 20 degrees cooler than one without many
Mm,
trees in the
mm,
summertime. Now, if you
mm.
think of the effects for the health effects for the elderly in that community,
Sure.
or the economic effects for using fans or air conditioning, um, there's lots of new research and really fascinating studies looking at the effects that nature has on our mental functioning, on the ways in which we
Mhm,
cue up our brains to deal with anxiety.
mhm,
These are ecosystem services too. They just may be a little less understood or get less attention than carbon.
mm, mm, mm.
Um, so what
Is
I
this is
find
it
promising,
is this sorry, is this one of these things where people talk about like green cities, right? Like where they
yeah,
try to not more of like green in terms of like, not using plastic straws or things. I mean, maybe that's included, but more of like trying to have to build infrastructure that has more capacities for different types of plant life. You'll see like certain buildings have on the tops of their buildings they'll have certain types of
yeah, or green spaces on the
vegetation or
sidewalk,
right,
trees
right, right.
on the road,
Hmm.
trees on your road or alongside your highways.
Hmm.
In the U.S., there's been American Forest has been a real leader in looking at tree equity. So the
Mm,
idea that we should have, given the many benefits that these trees provide, we should have equitable access to trees, and
mhm,
and all those benefits. And there have been studies showing, drawing associations between test scores and, and tree cover. So kids in schools with higher tree cover, they tend to perform better on tests. And these are correlations, hard to like tease out causation, but
Sure.
there's a whole movement in California and across the nation to increase tree cover around schools for a lot of different reasons, not just test scores. Um, so when you say what I feel is promising, I think part of what was so amazing in this journey to create Treekeepers, to write Treekeepers, was meeting the diversity of people involved and the diversity of ecosystems and communities and efforts that there are across the planet where people are wanting and needing and investing in and caring for more trees. Um, and I am optimistic about that. And I also think, yes, we have a lot of top down commitments in countries saying, like, let's plant X number of trees. When have we ever, like, let's put trees aside, like, when have we ever met at any global target or any national target that a country puts
Mm-hmm.
down? It's always like
Mm-hmm.
to inspire change and get change happening. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm uplifted by that in conjunction with the many, many efforts that are underway around the planet. There's a platform called Restore, no E, so yet another word for us, Restor. You can look it up, but you can actually track efforts to restore ecosystems. Most of them on the platform are forests, but there are many others as well. And you can see thousands of efforts around the world. Those aren't all carbon certified, or they're not. They range in size and the type of endeavor. But I also find these many different efforts uplifting and showing some future promise. So I think there's the diversity of people involved, the diversity of types of efforts and different kinds of ecosystems, the ways in which people are integrating trees into other land uses, this collective action component that we have, both top-down ambitious commitments that we won't meet, but will inspire some change,
Mm-hmm.
and a bottom-up movement, and also some leadership in doing this work in a climate smart way. So when you plant a tree today, if you choose to plant or if you are going to plant, you need to also think about, is that tree going to survive the future climate? I think there's some interesting innovative efforts to select species that will do better in the warming world that we're facing.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's going to be very, very. I have some hope. People, especially as the current generation, I guess you could say, the young folks. This is what they've really been growing up with, and so as they become adults and as they go into the world and as they start working in different places, really see this and to see the impact and see how you can practically combat some of these things. So I do have some promise, some hope from the kind of bottom up or bottom out kind of thing. So Lauren, this was so much fun. I really enjoyed talking with you about this. Your book is great, your work is great, and I really admire all the work you're doing. So a big thanks for coming on and talking to me about something that's really important. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for sharing these stories.
Of course.